from this setup where everybody need to edify, everybody is useful, to this setup where the few people are special gifted, how this shifting happened? Can you, do you find it somewhere in the history this kind of shifting happened? How this thing happened?
Yeah. Well, first off, you could say it naturally happened because as the numbers increased in every church, let's say in a home, let's say the numbers in a home start to increase beyond 50, get up to 70, get up to 80, get up to 200. You know, they're not going to fit in a home, and so there's going to be a compulsion to do something to be able to accommodate more people. So that's understandable, but then there's going to be a loss when you begin to have large groups gathering, especially when the purpose of the gathering is to build up one another. Now, I have 7 videos on YouTube that go through all the different facets of first century assemblies, and it's in video number 6 where I trace the development of the first century church and to ask the question why they developed worship services. It's rather odd and it's actually stunning that in the first century church they never described their gatherings as worship. They never described their gatherings as services, and they certainly didn't use the phrase worship service to refer to what they were doing. They were edification meetings. They were gatherings designed to build up one another. But what happened in the late first and early second century, the Lord's Supper began to be viewed as a sacrifice that the Christians offered to God, which is an odd thing because Christians are not required to offer sacrifices. That was something done in the Jewish temple. That was something done also in pagan temples. They offered sacrifices. And the Lord's Supper represents the body and blood of Jesus that was given for us. It was his sacrifice for us. It is not our sacrifice for God. But nonetheless, this shift took place early on there in early second century. And it's just beginning to be introduced in a few different places. But then it begins to grow for the next few centuries. The next development you see is that churches now have an altar. This was not true in the first century, but the Lord's Supper, once it's viewed as a sacrifice, then the table upon which it sits becomes an altar. And it was common in Judaism as well as in paganism. Sacrifices were offered on an altar. But this is foreign to New Testament thinking. And then the third thing that happens, it starts to get really going in the 3rd century, is the ministers who presided over that table began to be viewed as priests. And the term priest begins to be used in reference to the Christian leaders in the congregation at that time, which is really strange. You don't see that in the 1st century. You rarely see it in the 2nd as well. But it's already getting full blown by the middle of the 3rd century, especially with like Cyprian of Carthage. He uses that language extensively around 250 AD. And then the final step in this progression of thought happens by the 4th century, when if you're going to have a sacrifice that Christians offer, which is strange, and it's going to sit on an altar, which is also strange, and it's going to be presided over by a priest, which is not New Testament language, then the next step is the building in which these things took place began to be viewed as a temple. There is a speech recorded by Eusebius of Caesarea, a bishop, in around 320 AD. He is dedicating a magnificent cathedral that was essentially built with Constantine's money, and he calls it a holy temple of God, which is really strange in terms of Christian terminology. It's really strange in terms of 1st century terminology because the temple was done away with. Christians understood that they had no temples. And you see this clearly not just in the 1st century, but in the 2nd and the 3rd century as well. Christians resisted building any kind of temples. But by the 4th century, with the progression of this sacrifice, altar, priest, and then you have a temple in which all this stuff takes place. And that's how we pretty much got to where we are today, where we have these temples, these holy places, these houses of worship, which was a strange idea to the first century.